Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Today, we are continuing our Fuel Pulse Show Back to School episodes, where we go back and we dig into basic building blocks of fuel care. And we've been talking recently about considerations behind preventing winter gelling problems in stored ultra-low sulfur diesel. Now, in past episodes, we talked about how diesel fuels get gelling problems because of the effect that cold winter temperatures have on their ability to keep their wax content soluble. We also talked previously about the temperatures where you might expect problems to show up at. Now, we wouldn't be talking about all these problems if there weren't solutions to help with them. The common options to prevent gelling problems from happening that we see out there in the real world, so to speak, there's two big ones. There's adding an anti-gel chemical package to the fuel or diluting the fuel with kerosene. So first one, cold flow treatment. Now you might hear such chemical packages referred to by different names, cold flow improver, anti-gel, or some other kind of nomenclature. These are packages, combinations of multiple active ingredients, usually involving at least some version of a vinyl acetate molecule as one of the components. And they're formulated to act upon the wax crystals that come out of solution and to act on them in ways that mitigate the problems those wax crystals would cause if they were just left alone. Now, the ways that these cold flow packages act, they center on the principles of keeping the wax crystals dispersed and keeping them suspended. Okay, let's talk about that. If you have a bunch of individual wax crystals that appear in the fuel, but something acts, or there's something else in the fuel that's acting to keep those crystals separate and away from each other, to keep them dispersed, well, then they can't, by definition, they can't bump into each other. They stay away from each other. So they can't bump into each other. So they cannot actually grow bigger. And so if you do that, you've effectively got a bigger margin of time to use the fuel and to burn those wax crystals up. Also, you've got something that's keeping them from growing bigger like that. That means that by definition, they stay smaller. That means they can pass more easily through the fuel filter. And that means less fuel filter plugging, less cold flow problems. So that's keeping them dispersed, but also keeping them suspended is important too. You want to keep them in suspended because it does similar things. If those wax crystals, they have come out of solution, but instead of dropping down, they've got something that's keeping them uniformly suspended throughout the volume of the fuel. If you can do that, then A, they don't fall into each other and grow bigger that way, but also you don't get the problematic wax buildup on the fuel lines and on solid surfaces. So the aim is to keep that wax dispersed evenly throughout the body and the volume of the fuel. The better you can do that, the fewer problems you're going to end up with that commonly manifest themselves as gelling problems. Okay, so that's number one. That's cold flow treatments. Number two option is cutting it or diluting it with kerosene to lower the cold filter plug point. And that's kind of the old school solution to all this. Kerosene, of course, is number one diesel fuel. And kerosene, by definition, contains substantially lower amounts of paraffin wax content than the number two diesel fuel that it's being added to. Now, kerosene lowers cold filter plug point. How does it do it? Well, it does it by diluting the paraffin. There's no magic. There's no specific science involved. It's actually just simple dilution effects. However, simple as it is, it works. And that's why people have done it for a long time. Cutting with kerosene tends to be preferred by people who operate in really cold climates, say Alaska, Canada, places like that. And the reason why they prefer kerosene for those situations instead of anti-gel treatments is because as you get down to these really, really cold temperatures, 30 below, 40 below Fahrenheit, the colder you get, you tend to have to use increasingly higher amounts of anti-gel to get the cold filter plug point down to those really cold temperatures. Now, one thing we haven't considered, having laid out those two options, is what's the cost? How much does it cost to do either of these? Well, there's a certain amount of it depends, but let's talk about a few factors. First, cold flow improvers tend to be B2B business centric formulations. And as such, they're inherently cost sensitive because if you manage fuel, it's in your financial interest to prevent gelling problems. But the solution to that can't be too expensive if it's going to be workable for you. You should be able to expect, again, it depends when it comes to costs, but it's reasonable to expect anti-gel treatment for you to be able to hit somewhere between 10, 15 cents a gallon, maybe. Exact figures depend on how much you use and which specific one you use, but that kind of gives you a ballpark. Point here is if you're looking at something marketed as an anti-gel and it's going to cost you, 50 cents a gallon to treat, well, that's too much. It should not cost as much as that. Now, going back to kerosene, the cost for diluting ULSD with kerosene, that depends on the cost difference between the kerosene and the anti-gel. And it depends on how much kerosene you have to add to get your fuel where you need it to be. General rule is, when you talk about how much, if you need to lower cold filter plug point temperature by 5 degrees Fahrenheit, you should be able to do that for every 10% volume of kerosene that you add to the fuel. So if you have a tank of fuel that you want to get it lower by 25 degrees, well, then you might have to add 50% kerosene. Now, most decent anti-gel formulations should be able to achieve a 20, 25 degree drop at a reasonable treat rate. If you live in Michigan and you need to drop your cold filter plug point temperature by 25 degrees, maybe it costs you 15 cents a gallon to do it with an anti-gel. To do it by kerosene typically costs about 40 cents per gallon more than ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel. Now, sometimes that difference has dropped as low as 20 cents higher, but there's also been times where it's been like $1 higher. So let's say you need a 25 degree drop. So you have to use 50% kerosene. That means your effective treat cost is going to be 20 cents per gallon. If the price difference between kerosene and number 2 ultra-low sulfur diesel is more than 40 cents, then your effective treat cost is going to be more than 20 cents. So finally, question, when should you treat your stored fuel and how often? To do this, you need to look at the temperature forecast. You're looking for when the upcoming temperatures are expected to drop near or below the cloud point. That's when the wax comes out. So you want to have your anti-gel or your kerosene in the fuel before that happens. Now remember, typical diesel fuel cloud points around 16, 17 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on if it's summer or winter diesel. Now, given what you can and cannot know for sure about your fuel, you're going to have to allow yourself a buffer. You're actually going to want to treat or plan to treat when you see the upcoming forecasts to drop not below the cloud point, but to within 10 degrees of that cloud. Because remember, cloud point's only when the fuel's cloudy. The wax is actually starting to drop out X degrees above that. And so you want to make sure that you're prepared for that. You want to aim, rule of thumb, you want to aim for when the forecast says the temperature is going to be in the 25 to 30 degree Fahrenheit range. If you do that, you're going to be most prepared for most of the reasonable possibilities. Also, definitely watch whether the temperature is forecast to stay cold for consecutive days, and also whether the temperature is anticipated to drop, remember, sharply versus steadily. As we pointed out before, both of those phenomena can have a marked impact on when the fuel can have a marked impact on when the wax comes out of your fuel, and therefore when you need to treat. And these temperature trends are not only going to influence when you want to have your treatment in place, they're also going to influence your planning through the rest of the season. In the case of asking the question, if you need to retreat your fuel. Sometimes people ask that, if I treat my fuel once at the start of the season? Am I covered for the rest of the season? The answer is actually, it depends how many times that treatment has to act on waxes coming out of the fuel. Chemical treatments like anti-gels, they act on those waxes that are coming out of the fuel. And in a sense, they get used up as they respond to these gelling events. So if you're in a winter season and you have one or more gelling or clouding events early in that season, it might be worth your while to consider topping off your cold flow treatment so that you don't get caught by surprise later in the season if it happens again. Because we've all seen that the weather is more and more predictable. We've all seen that the weather's more and more unpredictable in recent years, and you don't want to get caught unprepared. So treating your fuel to protect against anti-gel, relatively inexpensive to do compared to the financial cost of having a gelling problem that shuts down operations of whatever kind of engine you're in charge. So that is the story behind how and when you should protect your stored diesel fuel against cold. Whether you dilute it with kerosene or you use a cold flow improver, you want to plan to put it in your stored fuel when the temperature forecasts call for a drop into the 25 to 30 degree Fahrenheit. Thanks for joining me today. If you liked what you heard on today's podcast and you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe at your podcast platform of choice, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you like to listen. And leave us a review if you can, because that really does help other people find us. So till next time, I am Erik Bjornstad. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.